And so in 1931, Japan invades the province of Manchuria, part of China. Britain fears that it alone now has to try to preserve the peace. The Americans don't care. They're isolationist. The French clearly lack the resources to try and preserve the peace. And can they even be trusted to act impartially in Europe? The British are not so sure. So we have here the words of the British Foreign Office in 1926. We have no territorial ambition. We have got all that we want, perhaps too much. Our sole aim is to keep what we have and to live in peace. The USA has retreated into its self-interested isolation. The French are determined to dominate Europe. The British are hoping, however, to preserve the peace of the world. But the USSR is seen as an expansionist threat, as are the empires of Italy and Japan. While unknown to the British, Hitler would want the greatest possible of all Germanys, stretching from the Rhine to the Volga in the USSR, and a world empire at least equal to that of the British. And yet, when it comes to it, the British lack the confidence in themselves to keep the peace. We have here the Conservative Party leader Bonner-Law in 1922. We cannot alone act as policemen of the world. And the same year, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Henry Wilson, our small army is much too scattered. In no one single theatre are we strong enough. In 1931, the Admiralty advises the British government that the Navy's strength is below that required to keep the sea lanes open in the event of a war. But is a war going to be necessary? In 1935, Britain and Germany reach a naval agreement where the German fleet would be allowed to grow to equal 35% of the Royal Navy. Hitler says an Anglo-German combination would be stronger than all the other world powers. But this indeed is the danger for the British. The British saw the Anglo-German naval agreement of 1935 as a step towards peace. Hitler, however, sees it as a first step on the road to a British-German military alliance against the French and the Russians. Certainly, Britain could have avoided fighting Nazi Germany. Sir Eric Phipps, the British ambassador to Germany, said, Hitler displayed an almost touching solitude for the welfare of the British Empire, while Hitler also told Phipps replacement, Sir Neville Henderson, I've always wanted a British-German understanding. As Hitler told Halder, the head of the German General Staff in 1938, if we crush England's military power, the British Empire will crumble. That is no use to Germany, but will benefit only Japan and the Americans. When the British did finally declare war on Hitler's Germany, he said he couldn't grasp what the English were really after, as even if England won, the real victors would be America, Japan, and Russia, which is, of course, quite prescient of him. Ultimately, the British could have avoided fighting Germany, but only by accepting German dominance of the continent in full alliance with Nazi Germany. In 1940, Goebbels said, sooner or later, the racially valuable Germanic element of Britain would have to be brought in to join Germany in the future struggle of the white race against the yellow, the Germanic against the Bolsheviks. So here is the danger for the British. Yes, the British can, it turns out, avoid fighting the Germans, but at a moral price that we would shudder to see. Indeed, a moral price that, thank God, we never contemplated paying. And so, unbeknownst to the British, the Germans will have to be fought again. But if war is to be avoided, then maybe Hitler could be deterred from starting a war. Now, in 1933, when Hitler comes to power, Britain has what is still arguably just about the most powerful fleet in the world. The French definitely have what could be put as the most powerful army. Unfortunately, the two countries are far from united. The Germans are, however, very, very weak in 1933. Now, the French army is truly excellent in 33. It created the world's first mechanised division, the DLM, and the first motor division in 1930 in General Weygand's modernisation programme of 1930 to 33. They did this 2 years before Germany. In 1932, the French began experiments with heavy tanks, and although they were perceived as a failure, the construction of these truly excellent vehicles continued. In 1934, the French General de Gaulle wrote a book calling for the creation of professional armoured divisions, much like the Panzer divisions that the Germans will have in the Second World War. But de Gaulle makes certain that he will be ignored by the French government by also calling for the creation of a professional volunteer army instead of a citizens' conscript force, which the French government was never going to do. The French government was terrified that their own army were going to topple democracy in France and impose a military government, possibly led by someone like de Gaulle, for example, who, let's face it, there is reasonable grounds to suspect him. And so the French government had determined to have a citizens' conscript force to stop a professional military coup by the French army. And so de Gaulle calls for the creation of these panzer divisions, these armoured divisions, but only in a professional volunteer army. But what is missing from the French and the British is confidence. Instead of preparing to take the offensive into Germany, work begins on the Maginot Line in 1930, an incredible series of defences along the French and German borders. They consider also fortifying the Belgian border. After all, they know that Germany has gone before in the First World War through Belgium into France, and they consider extending the Maginot Line up to the sea. But it's rejected, crucially, by one vote when the French government meet to discuss it. Now, certainly, it would have been very expensive to do it, especially in the wet coastal strip. And also, it would have been pointless at the time because France and Belgium were allies, full military allies in 1930, and had been since 1920. They did consider giving money to the Belgian government to fund fortifications in Belgium, but reject it due to the cost. In 1934, France starts to rearm, ordering the creation of a large air force, but the French cottage air industry couldn't cope with the size of the orders. They also produced obsolete multi-role aircraft, what are known as BCRs in France, that could do everything. They could act as fighters, as bombers, as naval bombers, as strategic bombers, as reconnaissance aircraft. They could do everything. They could do everything badly, very, very badly. And due to the financial difficulties, the pace of rearmament was slowed again in 1935, but still France is well placed in the 1930s with full military alliances with Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania and Yugoslavia. Germany in 1933 is weak, unarmed and encircled. Britain too lacks confidence in its ability to keep the peace. In May 1934, the Defence Committee recognised Germany as the biggest threat to world peace, but decide against building up a large army to deter Germany. Only 5 British divisions, in the event of war, they plan, will be sent to France. The RAF estimate that if Germany occupies the Low Countries, the Luftwaffe could drop 150 tons of bombs a day on London. In 1936, they raised this estimate to 600.